everyone, and welcome to the Architecture Around the World with Minecraft course. It is great to have you here. Perhaps this is your first StemQwest course experience, or maybe you are a seasoned quester and you are back for a second or even a third course with us. The Architecture Around the World with Minecraft class is going to be looking at architecture from each of these 6 continents that you see here on the screen. The only one we are not going to be visiting is the continent of Antarctica, which is actually absent here from our map. Now, if you previously took the Minecraft plus Architecture History course, that course followed more of a chronological sequence where we looked at architecture through the years from ancient times all the way through present day. This course is going to focus more on the geographic similarities and differences of architecture as we travel from one continent to another. So Minecraft Steve is curious, where should we start? Now we could start pretty much anywhere on the map. We could start on the far left in North America, but we are actually going to be starting more towards the far right of this map as we look at the architecture of the Far East. So for today, for our Far East Architecture Part 1 lesson, we are going to begin with one of the world's longest living civilizations that has had a great cultural impact on the architecture of many nations, and that is the architecture of China. So here you can see where China is situated. If we take the world and we divide it into hemispheres, if we draw a line from the North Pole down to the South Pole, this divides the Western Hemisphere from the Eastern Hemisphere. And this is where we get the definition of the Far East. So essentially the Eastern Hemisphere starts near this prime meridian line, and we have the Middle East in this section, and then we have the Far East, which covers these portions of Asia that we're going to be looking at for today. So let's actually take a look at a map of where China is located, because the geography of China and its location towards other civilizations and countries has had a huge impact on the architecture of this country. And so here you can see the borders of China. It's bordered a little bit by Russia in the northeast corner. It actually touches North Korea along another northeastern boundary. The Mongolian border lies to the north, which is very important. We're going to be talking about that here on the next slide. And then it has numerous other countries of kind of Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam, small borders with Thailand, Nepal, India, across the southern border. We are also going to be learning later in the week about how China has influenced some of the architecture of its neighboring countries, such as Korea and Japan. So we are going to start by looking at one of the oldest structures in architecture, and that is the Great Wall of China. Now, the Great Wall was built from the 7th century BC until nearly the year 1900. It was constantly in a state of construction, repair, remodeling, enlarging. The Great Wall itself is actually a series of walls. It is not just one wall, but you can kind of see here in the map in the upper right hand corner that the walls are actually divided into numerous sections. And so the largest section that you can see here in this picture on the screen was built in the Ming Dynasty period, which is within the last 600 years or so. The reason for the wall is that of protection. It's actually built to defend against the invading Mongols that came from the north. So a little historical context, in the early 1200s, about 800 years ago, Genghis Khan led the Mongols to defeat China. The Mongols invaded from the north. As you can see here on the map, this is the country of Mongolia is here, and that was the traditional home territory of the Mongols. And they moved towards the south to invade China. Thus the reason for the Great Wall as a barrier and a defense against these armies attacking from the north. You can see here in the picture that it has a decidedly medieval appearance. It has the battlements across the top, these little notches where the soldiers could stand guard and watch. It has these large paved, basically essentially raised roads where they could move armies of men and materials across the wall. And if the Mongols happened to make it to the far western side of the Great Wall, they would have had a very long, difficult march to actually make it all the way to Beijing, which is the capital city. So the Ming Dynasty was able to drive out the invaders, the Mongols, and they continued to fortify this Great Wall as a military defense against their warring neighbors to the north. Now, inside of Beijing, we actually see Beijing is the capital city of China. It's located in northeastern China. One of the reasons for it being located there is military in origin, because their most proficient invaders were coming from the north, and so situating the capital towards that region was strategic in order to be closely approximated to their soldiers being able to move equipment and supplies around that part of the country. Now, the Forbidden City in Beijing is actually the home of the Chinese emperors. So even though it's named as being a city, it's actually within the larger city of Beijing. Now, it is the largest ancient palace in the world. It was home to the Chinese emperors for nearly 500 years. It was built in the early 1400s with the help of over 1 million workers. It took 1 million workers to create 980 buildings, nearly 1,000 buildings, and it covers an area of 180 acres. So for those of you that happen to be sports fans, if you're familiar with the size of a large playing field that they use in American football or in soccer, they would be able to fit 120 soccer fields into the area that covers the Forbidden City. The city itself is steeped in symbolism, which we're going to talk about. You can actually see here the color of the roof is on purpose, the colors of the pillars, the placement of those columns, and even these guarding foo dogs that you see situated here outside of the building as a symbol of protection against, warding off of evil that would be trying to infiltrate the Forbidden City. The whole city itself is actually a walled rectangle inside of the walled imperial city, which was inside of the walled inner city, and then the actual Forbidden City itself was actually protected by these imperial guards. So if you're familiar with Star Wars, you know the imperial guards associated with that storyline. They were perhaps inspired by the imperial guards that stand watch over the Forbidden City. So here we can actually see a map of the Forbidden City. You can see the rectangular shape. The whole thing has a large tall wall that goes all the way around the perimeter, and you can actually see that there's also a moat. So similar, at the same time the Forbidden City was being created in the early 1400s, you're also seeing a number of fortresses and medieval castles being built in Europe in the same time period. Now we're not going to actually be looking at those medieval castles and forts in this course, but if you did previously take the architecture history class, or you're curious about learning more about castles, there is a whole unit dedicated to medieval Romanesque castles in that other course if you are interested in checking into that. So the Meridian Gate protects the palace to the south. Here you can see it shown here. Then to the north there is the Shenmu Gate, and in between there is a series of different courts and palaces. You can see it's aligned in this rectangular shape. Okay, each of these separate buildings is its own palace. They had large court areas for demonstrations and gatherings of large groups of people. There's also, you can see, a lot of greenery and gardens and some kind of ancillary palaces off to the side. Those would be for the supporting services that are part of the governing body and the support system of the emperor that governs all of China. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at what these buildings look like up close. Here you can see we are now inside of the main Meridian Gate leading into the Forbidden City. You see that these are very symmetrical buildings. If you draw a line right down through the center, you can see that they are very symmetrical. Okay, that is important in Chinese architecture because it is a visual representation of everything being in balance. You can also see a lot of times buildings are positioned in groups of 3. The number 3 in Chinese culture is synonymous with heaven, and so it's common to see buildings replicated in 3s or columns in groups of 3s or 9s. The buildings are also arranged from north to south. So in the northern hemisphere, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, but because of the rounded shape of the globe of the Earth, the sun is always positioned a little bit to the south, even in the summer. And so the direction of the sun's energy coming from the south represents warmth and holiness. So the buildings are positioned to have their openings facing towards the south, towards that warmth, while the back of the building faced towards China's enemies, the Mongols from the north, and the cold wind that blew into the country from the north. So if you've ever heard the phrase turning your back on someone as being a sign of disrespect, that's actually shown in Chinese palace architecture as the front side of the building faces the warmth and the holiness of the sun that's coming from the south, whereas the back of the building is facing essentially pointed towards their enemies and blocking out that cold wind that comes from the northern direction. Now, in terms of the colors that you see here in the palace, the color yellow was known to be the color of the emperor and symbolize ultimate power. It is also associated with, royalty and prosperity. Red is perhaps the most common color that you would come across in Chinese architecture, and red is synonymous with the color of fire. And so this red color represents luck and joy and happiness, so that's commonly seen throughout Chinese architecture. Black is actually the color of water, and you're going to say, well, that's kind of weird because we usually associate blue with water. Well, in Chinese symbolism, water is actually synonymous with the color black, whereas blue is actually the color of wood. Okay, so blue represents the element of wood in Chinese culture, and growth and optimism, whereas green is representational of standing for growth, wealth, harmony, ecological friendliness. And so we're going to take a little bit more in-depth look at those elements and colors in a later slide. Now, this is one of the buildings inside of the Forbidden City, and this is the Palace of Heavenly Purity. And this was actually the sleeping quarters for the emperor. And you can actually see here in the drawing there's a little Minecraft emperor there on the tops of those steps. You see a lot of other symbols embedded into Chinese architecture, namely lions, or what are known as foo dogs, are shown here on the left. Okay, they are not supposed to actually be a physical representation of a lion. It's more of a mythological creature. As you saw in the earlier picture, they often appear in pairs, and they are symbolic of being protectors of the building. Another symbol that you would commonly see is the dragon. Now, we can actually see there's like this dragon statue that's shown over here on the right, but you can actually see where there is dragons painted like in gold gilding across the top of this room. And so those colors of yellow and gold being associated with the emperor, the dragon actually being, again, a symbol of luck and strength and power. The dragon is also commonly seen to be holding some sort of an orb, or it's often referenced as being a pearl, and that's symbolic of wisdom, of holding on to that wisdom. So the dragon is something that you will commonly see both in ancient artifacts and ancient buildings of China, as well as those of new buildings. So here you can see some of those traditional features in a relatively modern new building. You can see those bright red columns that are supporting the roof. You can see a lot of yellow and gold that's been incorporated into the color motif. Those are probably the two most common colors that you would see in Chinese architecture. But you can also see where they've brought in some of these other elements, okay, such as the dark wood of the furniture. And then you also see the greenery of the plants. It's common to see a mixture of textures and colors, whether it be wood and plants and metals, because in traditional Chinese architecture, you want to have a balance of the 5 elements of nature. You can also see there is kind of some hidden symbolism. If you look around the room, you might be able to spot a crane. Okay, so here's actually a crane statue sculpture. There's actually a couple of them. There is a dragon that's actually carved into the side paneling of these walls, and the dragons actually adorn the top of this furniture here as well. So those are kind of some, you see a lot of symbolism embedded within Chinese architecture, not just in the building itself with the colors and the columns, but also with the symbolic carvings and sculptures that would decorate the buildings. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier about these 5 elements of nature. So they would be water, wood, fire, earth, and metal. And the theory in Chinese philosophy that's used to describe these interactions between these 5 elements is represented by the arrows. Okay? So wood, fire, earth, metal, and water are believed to be the fundamental elements of which everything in the universe interacts and is made from, and each element has a counterbalance. So you can actually see in the arrows, okay, that water is the counter for fire. Okay, metal is the counter for wood. Okay, so for example, you would use like a metal axe or a saw to chop down the wood. Okay, or you would use water to extinguish the fire. Okay, but you use the fire, it has control over the metal, because if you heat the metal up, then it becomes weak and it bends. And so that's symbolic here as shown on these Chinese 5 elements of nature wheel. Now, Steve happens to know a little bit about these, because if you play Minecraft for any length of time, you would know that these 5 elements are also found within the game of Minecraft. So you have metal in the form of ores, you have water, of course, wood blocks, fire, and the dirt blocks representative of the earth. So pretty interesting that those 5 elements of Chinese theory are also found within the game of Minecraft, and I think that is pretty cool. Now, our last design concept that we're going to cover for this part 1 lesson is that of feng shui. Now, you may have heard of this word previously, but you might not know exactly what it means. So feng shui literally translates into wind and water, but it is actually a combination of all of those different elements being imparted into architecture, not only the architecture shape and form of the building on the outside, but also that of the inside. Okay, so in feng shui, the site or the building is configured to be in harmony with the spiritual forces. Ancient Chinese buildings were generally not that tall, and so as skyscrapers came to be in more modern time, that kind of threw off the feng shui. And if you look at buildings along the coastal regions of Macau or in Hong Kong, you actually see what are called dragon gates. And these have been designed into the modern skyscrapers. And when you look at them at first from the outside, you might think that it's strictly for aesthetics, to make the buildings look cool. But it's actually deeply rooted in Chinese symbolism. So in China, the belief is that the dragons, again, symbols of protection and wealth and prosperity, that they live in the mountains, but then they need to fly down to the sea. And these tall buildings obstruct their path from getting from the mountain to the sea. And so what they have done in the skyscraper architecture of many buildings is incorporated these dragon gates that allow the dragons to essentially fly through the buildings and not be impeded by the architecture. So it's essentially related to the feng shui, or the harmony with the spiritual forces. So that's how you might incorporate that into the exterior of your building designs. You can also incorporate feng shui into the interior. Now let's take a look at this picture in the top right. This represents a living room, but you can see that there are numerous elements that are incorporated so that one element is not overpowering. Okay, so we have this element of fire in the red of the chair. Well, the red chair and the red cushions on the couch need to be balanced out by water. Remember, black is the symbol of water in Chinese culture. So this circular round shape, the black rectangular frame, even the color of the wood that's used in the table, that is used to offset the fire element of the water. At the same time, you also bring some of these woody elements and natural elements like plants into the house. So it's very common to incorporate, potted plants and things into the interior design of a building. Now, if you look down here at this bathroom, the bathroom is heavily dominated by the water element. So in this case, you need to come up with something to counteract that water element. So by incorporating some of the white colors that represents metal, you can actually see that incorporated here into the fixtures. They also, again, bring some of that outside in, which is represented here by the potted plant in the green vase here on the shelf. And then the light fixtures, which are a little bit caught off here in the picture, actually represent, the flame of the fire. So even though the bathroom itself is heavily dominated by the water element, it's important to incorporate the other 4 elements into the room, because you don't want to ever have a room be overly dominated by any one element. So here in summary, for Chinese architecture, the Chinese culture is one of the longest surviving cultures on Earth, and as such, the design characteristics of China can be found in many other countries, especially those of the Far East and Southeastern Asia, which we're going to get to in our Part 2 lesson later this week. Traditional Chinese buildings are known for their symmetry, which is symbolic of balance, balance with nature, and also the balance within the different parts of your life. So it's very common to see squares, rectangular shapes that are perfectly symmetrical in Chinese design, which we'll look at some examples of those in Minecraft in just a minute. The colors, shapes, and even the creatures have deep meaning in Chinese architecture. The color and the shape of the buildings is not by accident. Even those holes in those modern skyscrapers have a deeper meaning that's not usually known to those of other civilizations. And lastly, feng shui includes the exterior and the interior of the building, with the goal of creating a balance between those 5 elements. Feng shui characteristics include bringing the outdoors in and not having any building or room be dominated by any one element. So keep that in mind as you work through your architecture creations in Minecraft for this module. Speaking of, here are some examples of some things that you might make in Minecraft. So here in the top left, you can see this is kind of an entranceway or a gate that's done in stone with various stone textures to add some extra detailing. This might be representative of like the gates that go into the Forbidden City. Here you can see in the top right, this is representative of a palace that's supported by those red columns. Again, those red columns representing, prosperity and wealth and strength. So using the color red to hold up the roof of the building is symbolic in and of itself. And now in this bottom picture, obviously this one uses a texture pack or a mod, so you're welcome to use those if you would like. This is representative of a small scale model of the Forbidden City. Obviously making all 980 buildings of the Forbidden City would be terribly difficult to do. But if you did want to model a smaller version of the Forbidden City for your project this week, you certainly are welcome to do so. This one's complete with some landscape elements on each of the corners there with the trees that they've planted. It's got the moat of water to protect around the outside of the palace structure, and they've used some different kinds of stone to represent the different terraces and plaza areas that are within the Forbidden City. Now, lastly, if you want to do something a little bit more modern, you are totally welcome to design perhaps a city skyline or a skyscraper that perhaps incorporates some of those feng shui characteristics, like the dragon gates with the holes in the buildings, like you might find in the areas of Macau or Hong Kong in China. Or you might get a little creative and design your own dragon or even a foo dog by combining some different types of shapes and blocks. You can see here this one incorporates some different wooden buttons and some stair blocks and even some trap doors kind of turned sideways in order to create some more sculptural elements like that of the foo dog. So thank you so much for joining me for our Part 1 lesson for this week on Chinese architecture. We are going to continue it later this week with Far East Architecture Part 2, and I look forward to seeing you then. Until next time, happy crafting!